Hi and welcome to another episode of Labbing It. In today's video we continue on to part 2 of our two-part series where we have been integrating a NetApp storage device with our VMware and Veeam environment. In part 1 we configured a NetApp device in our Melbourne data center. We created some NFS storage and presented that storage into our VMware environment, and then we moved the workload onto that NFS volume and then integrated it all into Veeam, and we performed a backup from storage snapshot, which worked successfully. And in addition, we also told Veeam to retain snapshots on the Melbourne NetApp to provide an extra or additional recoverability options. So in this video, we're going to now move to our Sydney data center. We're going to pretty much do the same thing. We're going to set up another NetApp appliance in DR, and we are going to start configuring it to be able to take volume snapshots from our Melbourne data center and place them in our Sydney data center, which can be used for, say, DR scenarios. So the process for that, once we've set up and running, we'll set up our intercluster interfaces on both sites to allow our NetApp devices to start talking to each other. And then we'll configure some peering between the two specific appliances. We'll configure some protection policies, which allows us to configure volume relationships, i.e. we're going to do some snap mirroring from our Melbourne data center to our Sydney data center. And then we're going to reconfigure our Veeam backup job that we created in our last video to add the SnapMirror component as well and do a little bit of testing. So let's get into the lab and we'll get started. Okay, so pretty much like we did in the last video, we are going to now set up another virtual machine with the OnTap operating system installed. So what I'm going to do, actually I might just fix up again just so that you can see this process. This is exactly from the previous video, so I'm not going to go through it in really any detail this time around. I'm just going to open up the OVA file, and I'm going to call this one the SID NetApp 1, and I'll install it into here, SID NetApp 1, and import. So I'll just get that going. So if you remember from the previous video, the first thing we needed to do, well, configure the virtual machine. So I'm going to I'm not going to elaborate on anything here. This is exactly what we did in the previous video, and I sort of described exactly why we doing what we were doing. So expand that to 500 gig, and these are going to be Sydney adapter 3, which is EOC, is going to be on our Sydney management network, and Sydney NetApp cluster, just NetApp cluster. So just remember, we are not using NetAdapter 0 or NetAdapter 1, 2, and 4. They are installed by default with the simulator. I'm not comfortable in just deleting them, even though I'm not using them. So I'm just going to leave them there. They're just sort of doing nothing. Everything's going to be configured on this adapter. Done. All right, I'm going to power this up to boot up. So I'll just pause the video here, and we'll wait for the prompt, the login prompt to come. Okay, done. So just remember, we need to configure the disks first so that everything gets installed with 1 gig disks. We are going to fix that up and install with 10 gig disks. It's just, didn't like that. There we go. So let's just go through that process real quickly. So first we need just to set some passwords. So security login. My scroll lock's playing up. So security login, password, username, admin. new password, and then unlock the Diag account, and then set the password for the Diag account. Done. Set privilege, advanced, yes. And set Diag, yes. Then system shell node local password, the Diag password, and set environmental path. Done. CD, so we're just going to change the directory. These are the current disks. We are going to remove them because they're too small. Also need to remove this folder reservations, and then we quickly create the new disks. Just to reiterate, these are the disk choices. We're going to choose disk 36, disk type 36. So sudo vsim make disks, number of 14 per shelf, 4 shelves total, of type 36 on shelf 0. Shelves are numbered 0 to 3. So we're just running the same command on all 4 shelves, and that's it. Exit, reboot, yes. And when we reboot, we need to hit Control C to get the boot menu. This shouldn't take too long. Go. I'll hit enter here just to proceed to boot up, and then we'll hit Control C when prompted. That's now. Boot menu will be available. And just like in the first video, I'm just going to press number 4, which is to redo a clean configuration and initialize all the disks. Option 4. And I think it's going to give us, prompt us to acknowledge what we are doing. Yes, yes. Okay. All right, I'll pause the video again, and I'll come back once this is complete. Like I said in the previous video, I don't touch anything here. I let the simulator do all of its reconfiguration and initialize those disks, and then we'll be ready to start configuring this NetApp. Okay, all done. So just confirm yes for auto support, even though we're not really going to use it. It's just to avoid the warnings in the graphical interface. Now it's asking for the node management interface, EOC. So as it's like the last video, everything runs on EOC. So I'm happy to accept the default. It's now asking for the IP address. So let's quickly look at our Sydney network now. So that's our Melbourne network. So it's a little bit more expansive with some more workloads. Obviously, we've got ESXi environments. We've got a bunch of physical machines, including all the way on the left is Mel NetApp 1. Basically, the settings are going to be, or the IP settings are going to be exactly the same, except configured for the .20 subnet. So we'll be using 20.5 for the node IP and 20.6 for the cluster IP. So let's go back into our lab. So 20.5, 192.168.20.5, and 24-bit network, and the gateway is 20.1. And now it's asking, do we want to complete the cluster setup? Yes, we do. So we just hit enter. And so just bear in mind here, we are not joining an existing cluster. This appliance is also a single node cluster in the Sydney site. So we've got one in Melbourne, it's just a single node cluster. This is a single node cluster in the Sydney site. So we're just going to create a cluster. Then it's asking, is it a single node cluster? Yes, it is. And asking for the password. And now the cluster name. So the other cluster, so the Melbourne cluster, I think we called it Mel NetApp Primary. So I might just do the same thing and just call it SID NetApp Primary. Actually, I might just call it Secondary. Yeah, that's all right. I'll leave it at that. SID NetApp Secondary, because that's essentially what it is. It's going to be our DR location. We don't intend to be running sort of production workloads here, unless of course there is a DR situation. Hit enter. It's going to go away and create the cluster services now. I might just pause the video just briefly while that's happening. Okay, that's all done. License keys, I'm not going to worry about for now. I'll add them in later. Now it's asking for the cluster management interface port. So everything again is in EOC. It's case sensitive. Be mindful of that. So we don't want EOA. I want EOC. And then it's asking for the IP address, which is 20.6. So the node is 20.5. The cluster is 20.6. 192.168.20.6. And we've got a 24-bit mask for that as well. It understands what we think the gateway might be. So I just hit enter and accept 20.1. DNS names, JT Airlines.internal. So that was the same as the Melbourne site. And then the DNS server. So we got 10.10 and 10.14. So they're obviously, these DNS servers are obviously in a different subnet. I will plan to get a domain controller over here on the Sydney site once I get things more established. But for now, 10.10, 10.14 on the Melbourne site. Remember in the previous video, we set up our site-to-site VPN, so we've got connectivity across the two sites. Where is the controller located? So we'll call it Sydney. And we don't need to configure our backups. And hit enter, and we're done. So the first thing I'm going to do is just going to quickly log in. And much like I did with the Melbourne appliance, I'm just going to configure the time settings and NTP. So if I go cluster date show, we see here that it's on UTC. I'm going to modify that to cluster date, modify time zone. And if I hit Australia, again, actually I'll go back like I did in the other video. We see that if I hit the tab button after time zone, I can see a list of options. I'm in Australia, or this appliance is in Australia. And if I do that and hit tab again, then I'll get even more options for Australia, which is Sydney. So the first one we've got in Melbourne, this one's in Sydney. For those not wary of the time zones in Australia, Melbourne and Sydney are pretty much on the same time zone. So there shouldn't be any changes there. And if I go cluster date show again, now it tells me it's the 21st of February, it's 1 a.m. in the morning. That is not the case. It's actually the 20th of February and 2:01 p.m. as I do this video. So I'm going to configure my NTP server. If I want to see what's configured by default, this will show you that there is nothing. So I'm going to add a NTP server in. So it's cluster time service NTP server create ntp.internode.on.net. So whatever NTP server you plan on using, it could be a server, it could be something external. I've always just used my ISP. I've never had any faults with it. And if it doesn't work on the first try because it's having some issues resolving, actually, it's going to have some issues there with my typing. There we go. And I show NTP servers now. We can see that's now correctly configured. And if I go to date show, now it's the 20th of February. It's 2:02 p.m. and the time zone is set correctly. Can't stress enough how important that is to make sure that your time zones are set, especially when you're integrating with other NetApp appliances. Maybe you're running in clustered mode, so a multi-node cluster. or if you're integrating with other components like we are. So we are integrating with VMware. If the time's out of sync, VMware won't be happy. It won't allow you to export the NetApp's volumes to it. Same with Veeam. Veeam won't back things up properly if the times are out. So these have got to be all in sync. Okay, so that's all done. So what we'll do now, we'll go and, like we did in the first video, we'll go and set up the actual disks through the graphical interface. So back into my PC. Actually, one thing I might do is just set up DNS as well for this second cluster. So in DNS, I've got Mel NetApp primary going to 10.6. I'm going to set up another A record here, SID NetApp secondary, and that is going to 20.6. Now, so I'm doing this from a PC in the Melbourne site. We're going to connect across to the Sydney NetApp. So I should be able to go SID NetApp secondary dot JT Airlines dot internal. Probably didn't really need that. And accept. Sign into System Manager. We're not using BlueXP, which I think is a cloud-based management platform. I'm just having a guess at that. And we are here. So like we did in the previous video, I just need to configure up the remaining disks. So we've got 56. 3 get used for aggregate, 1, 2, 3. So that's for the operating system tier. So that leaves us with the other 53. And what I'm going to do is just assign these all to the SID NetApp secondary node. I just need to get rid of, untick the aggregate ones. These are ones that have already been used. Now you see this assign button and just accept that node, assign. We see in the top right here, it's going through and assigning the disks, and we should see the owner populate for all of these disks to the node. Now, when I played around with this in my testing, I found that if I went and clicked ahead into the second page to get to the second lot of disks, I found that sometimes it caused a bit of a problem. I'm not sure why. I had to come back to number 1 and reassign the disks, but that might have been just a once-off. And I kind of thought, oh, I've learned my lesson here, so I'll just let it do its thing before I flick over to the next page. So I'll wait until it's complete. So I was hitting assign and then going straight to the third page. So in this case, I'm just going to wait until it's complete, and I see the green light, and then I just wait and see this all populate. There we go. Okay, and then I'll just go to the final one, final page, sign, and sign. Excellent. And now I'm just going to quickly do the licensing. So that's under the cluster settings. Inside here, add, using a legacy set of keys. So with the simulator, it's the exact same keys as I used in the Melbourne data center. Because it's not part of, they're not part of the same cluster, you can reuse these keys to create pretty much as many nodes as you like, as long as they're not assigned to a cluster. If they are assigned to a cluster, there is some information on how to set that up. There is a second set of keys, I believe, and you have to rearrange a couple of things to make it all work. But that's all I'm doing here. So go add, and all these feature sets become compliant and ready for use. Okay, so storage VMs is where we need to go next. Now let's just have a quick look at the Melbourne side. Melbourne, so that's Mel NetApp primary. Next and proceed. Just got to remember, what did I call the SVM over here? Storage VMs, primary SVM. So I think I'll just call this secondary SVM. So secondary SVM, not going to enable anything at this stage, and I'm not going to use a storage VM administrator account. That's if you'd configure this if you want to do more granular role-based access, so that you create an administrator account that only has access to this storage VM and nothing else inside sort of this management part of the cluster. And click save. Oh, reason. We haven't created the aggregate. Sorry, I've jumped the gun. So we need to do that first. So I do that normally in here through the CLI. I won't bore you with the details of what's going on here because I've already done this in a previous video. So this is the command discount 53, this type fcal raid type raid dp. Scroll down, yes, and that is being queued. Just come back to here. So one thing I want to check just on the disks of the Melbourne cluster, did assign all of them, didn't I? So they're all aggregate, all aggregate, all aggregate, all aggregate. Yep, that's good. And we should get the, yep, that's completed. So now we should see a tier here, 356 gig, just like the Melbourne site. And all the disks should now be classed as aggregate. Yeah, okay, we can quickly go back into here and fix up our storage VM. Sorry, just primary SVM, just wanted to get the name again. Okay, secondary SVM, not going to do anything, just click save. That should be a little bit happier now. Done. Beautiful. Okay. So if we just take a quick look at our tasks here. So we've configured now the NetApp in the disaster recovery site. Now, albeit we haven't created any volumes or anything like that because we technically don't really need to for this this NetApp appliance. For what we're trying to achieve, we actually want to replicate a volume from the Melbourne side to the Sydney side. So don't need to necessarily create any volumes over here in the Sydney side. So the next step here is to set up the intercluster interfaces. So let's do that. We're going to do it on both sites, and we do that under protection and under overview. So this sets up the communication between different clusters. So we need to provide an IP address. So this is on the Sydney NetApp, and if we check the Sydney network intercluster IP, that's what we're calling it, 192.168.20.8. So let's punch that into here, 192.168.20.8, and it's a 24-bit mask, gateway 20.1, and broadcast domain and port. Don't need to be concerning ourselves with that. That's just left at default, and save. So that's on one site, and we need to do the same thing. I'll just put that over there on the Melbourne side. So let's go into protection, overview, and add a network interface. And if we have a look at our Melbourne network, it's instead of 20.8 for Sydney, it's just 10.8 for Melbourne. 192.168.10.8, and that's all good. Hit save. Done. Next, we need to set up the peering between the prod and the DR services. Kind of make them known to one another is the next bit, and they will connect to one another over those intercluster interfaces, or the intercluster settings network interfaces, as you can see here. So this is not complicated to set up. It's actually quite simple. Just need to follow the bouncing ball here. So I'm going to click peer cluster. So I'm on the Melbourne node doing this, and I'm going to provide SVM permissions of all SVMs that I have in the Melbourne appliance. So the Sydney appliance is going to be able to see those. And over here we set up the remote site. It's asking for a passphrase, which we could get from the remote or from the Sydney cluster, or we can just make it life easy for ourselves. There's an option here to launch remote cluster. So I'm going to click on this option. Let me just try that again. And it's asking me for the cluster IP address of the Sydney site, which is 192.168.20.6, and we are using 9.7 or later, and we go launch. And essentially what we're doing here, we're just logging in to the Sydney cluster, but it's going to take us right to the cluster peer passphrase generation page. So let's go into here, and all we need to do here is just copy this passphrase. So go copy, and we can close, and we can actually close this window. So we're back here in the Melbourne appliance, and we just paste that passphrase in, and we just click outside of that blue box, and then all of a sudden it knows the IP address that we are interfacing with, and we should be able to initiate the cluster peering. And that has been created. So let's just give it a moment. I think we should see something here. Let's click in and out. There we go. Cluster peers, SID, NetApp secondary. And then if we check over here, sorry, I had to pause this video as I was making it because I had to go and pick up my son from school. And there we go, log back in. And now we see the cluster peer here. So it's automatically connected on this side as well. So now both the Melbourne cluster and the Sydney cluster are now able to talk to one another. And now we can effectively set up what they call volume relationships, where we can organize for volumes to be replicated between each of the sites. So let's do that next. So to protect the volume, there's a few ways you can do this. I'm just going to go under protection, under relationships, and bring down this protect box and choose protect volumes. There's a few things you can do here. I'm only interested in protecting our vSphere NFS volume, so I'll choose that. On the left hand side here we have the source details that we need to enter in. So it's Mel NetApp primary, the storage VM is primary SVM. As soon as we click that, policies pertaining to this storage VM shows up. There are a few default policies here. This is important that we choose the correct one, or there are a few that you could choose that would work with from Veeam, within Veeam, but I normally would choose a legacy policy and just choose the mirror latest. Now you can actually create your own policy if you want to, if you don't want to use one of these default ones, and you can just create it with the same setting, and you could call it the Veeam policy or something like that. There's no issues with that. You can create a protection policy inside the SVM settings, much like when you create the export policy or a snapshot policy. So I'm just going to choose mirror latest, and then just choose the volume that I want to protect, or the volumes that I want to protect. It's just this one, vSphere NFS. So that's the source side, and then on the cluster side, this kind of automatically filled out for me. it's going to create a brand new volume in the Sydney cluster called vSphere NFS Destinal Dest. So I don't need to worry about creating, it's going to automatically happen. And this tick box here, initialize relationship, is actually going to mean that this relationship between for this volume between the two clusters are going to be configured straight away, and we're going to replicate that data across. So I'm going to hit save here. This is going to initiate the relationship that we're after, and we'll have a quick look at what's actually going to happen now for the next 15-20 minutes, which is pretty much copying data from the Melbourne cluster to the Sydney cluster with regards to this volume. Let's give this a second. Okay, it says not initialized because it's not actually ready to go yet. If we jump back into the Melbourne cluster, we go to volumes and we go to vSphere NFS. What we can see now is an additional snapshot copy has been created. This is kind of temporary in some respects because we don't really want the NetApp to do any of its own snapshot work. We want Veeam to orchestrate that, which are these two snapshots here that were created as part of our backup policy that we made in the previous video. So this has been taken and this is what's been copied across to the Sydney cluster, and that's as far as this SnapMirror is concerned. So now we see this not initialized. Once the data is copied, this will go into a healthy state. And then once we've got some backups, some snapshot copies going again, can actually delete this NetApp created snapshot. We don't really want to see, we don't want that. We just want Veeam to handle everything. But I think this is just a requirement as part of setting up the relationship. So Veeam can't do any SnapMirror. So in here, Veeam can't do secondary target. So when we go to add the SnapMirror, and if we were to run this right now, it would fail. And it can't do a SnapMirror without a proper relationship setup. And as far as I'm aware, and looking through some of the documentation, this is the best way to do it. There might be a better way. Definitely leave any thoughts of your own in the comments if you've got a better way or a better policy that I should have used. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you're a NetApp expert and have been working with Veeam as well. So if I come back here, so this volume is this volume is about 11 gig in size, and whilst I can't see there's an option to see how far along the mirror is going. There's not like a bar that tells us how far along it is, but I can tell by coming over here and coming to the newly created volume in the Sydney cluster. We can see exactly how big it is. It's currently at 2.36 gig, so that's going to grow out to about 11 gig. It's a thin provisioned volume as well, so I think it's going to go up to a maximum, I suppose, of 100 gig as per the original the source volume. So yeah, it's about 2.36. So I'm going to pause the video here. This will take about 10-15 minutes to complete, and when we come back, we've got a little bit more configuration to do, and then we can get stuck into Veeam. Okay, I think we're done. I can see a little green tick here saying that this volume is protected. And if I come in here and have a look at our SnapMirror, and we are in a healthy mirrored state. So that's successfully synced across to the secondary, to the Sydney cluster. So just a couple of things that we need to do on the Sydney cluster to get this all up and running and allow Veeam to be able to manipulate or to process this cluster. We just need to come into the volume. We need to create a mount path for the volume, which doesn't happen automatically when we configure the relationship. So we'll put in the mount path and click save. And on this VM, we need to enable NFS. And it's configured, it's showing up disabled because I have actually enabled it before and then just I've taken it away. So we'll just come back in and enable it. And as a result, because I did that before, unlike the first video, I'm not getting an option here to enter an IP address. So I'll have to do that manually. So I'm going to hit save, and it's giving me a warning there's no interface. So I need to fix that up. Down under network, under overview, if you're setting this up for the first time, you probably would have had the ability to put the IP address in. So you may not need to follow this set of instructions. But in any case, create a name for this interface. So these are what they call LIFs, logical interface. I might just call this vSphere NFS. Oh, I've done it before with testing. vSphere NFS test NFS interface. Actually, probably should call that LIF because that's what it technically is. And then the IP address, which I think is 20.7. I'll just double check. NFS IP 192.168.20.7. 192.168.20.7. 24-bit gateways 20.1 and save. And that's it. So our volume should now be accessible. If I come back to storage VMs, that NFS warning will have disappeared. Yep, it's all enabled and ready to go. Okay, so now that that's all configured, we can jump into the Veeam server and configure up the secondary storage. Okay, so into the VBR server and down to storage infrastructure. So there we've got our primary NetApp, our Melbourne cluster. Now we are going to add our Sydney cluster. Add storage, OnTap, and it's SID NetApp secondary. It's block storage for vSphere. At least that's what it's going to be. In the event that there's some sort of disaster recovery situation. Credentials, I'm just using the same credentials, so I put in the same admin password for my Melbourne cluster as well as for my Sydney cluster. If you've got a separate admin password, then you'll need to add those credentials in. Continue. No fiber channel, no iSCSI. This time I'm just going to put the export rules in automatically. If we jump back here and have a look at the export rules for this SVM, here I've got it already. Export policies, you've got the default policy just like in the Melbourne cluster, but this time it's got no rules. In the previous video we created the rules ourselves because we needed to add like the ESXi servers for the Melbourne environment. We're not going to do that just yet over here, but the proxy server that we're going to use to interact, the Veeam proxy server that we're going to use to interact with this cluster, those details need to be added in here. So back to VBR. So if we let it create the export rules automatically, it's going to populate some rules in here. It's pretty much going to look at our proxy server, see all the IP addresses pertaining to that proxy server and add them in. So let's choose the proxy server. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, you've got a Melbourne proxy server going to process data on a Sydney-based NetApp. If you're not familiar with Australia, Melbourne and Sydney are about 1,000 kilometers away, 600-700 miles away from one another. In the real world, I suppose you could have significant bandwidth to allow for that to happen across a WAN link, but the best practice from Veeam is always to have the proxy server as close to the storage device as possible. In my case, I don't have one, but normally you would have a Sydney-based proxy server as well. This is just a lab environment, so I'm not going to actually see any performance issues as a result of doing it this way. But if I was doing this properly, I would have a Sydney proxy server added in and let the Sydney proxy server process the data. But in any case, I'm not going to worry about it for now. I'm just going to use our Melbourne proxy, and I'm happy with that. Go apply and complete, and I'll run a scan of the storage. So it's just going to check and see what's on this NetApp storage as it is. There should be just one. Well, there'll be two volumes, the root volume and the replicated vSphere NFS volume, as well as a SnapMirror snapshot. It's all done. Let's expand and have a look. Yeah, it's exactly how we see it now. Now we can't really delete this SnapMirror just yet. We will once we start getting Veeam to orchestrate the snapshots and move them across to the secondary site. Once we've got that in place, then I think we can go ahead and just remove these initial snap mirrors created by the NetApp system. It was just part of the relationship build. It's got nothing to do with Veeam. As you can see here, they're crash consistent snapshots. I want application consistent snapshots, which is what Veeam can produce as a result of this this relationship. So we can orchestrate that all out of the Veeam console. So once we're up and running, we can delete these, and then Veeam will handle all the snapshots on the NetApp's behalf, which is really good, and obviously create application consistent snapshots. Okay, so that's done. Let's fix up our job to include the Sydney cluster, and we'll go from there. So back up in the Home tab, let's right mouse click this job. Let's have a look and see, just see how it's been configured. We are backing up the vSphere NFS data store in the Melbourne cluster, and the primary job, the main backup job, is to back that data up to a Linux hardened repository, which I have in my Melbourne environment, and it's been configured to do backups from storage snapshots, so it's got the integration there, which is really good. And then we've got this secondary target, and we already configured in the previous video to retain a couple of snapshots in the Melbourne cluster. So we've set retain 2, and if we have a look in our Melbourne cluster under snapshots for the volume, and we can see that Veeam has done that exactly. Now we do have this third one that has been recently created, but it has nothing to do with Veeam. Veeam can see it, no problems, and we can actually restore data from it, no problems. But Veeam didn't orchestrate this. That was the NetApp as part of the relationship build. We're going to delete this at shortly, but we can see that it's retaining 2 snapshots. So back in Veeam, we're going to add a SnapMirror. So we're not going to do SnapVault. SnapVault requires a slightly different relationship configuration. I'm not going to worry about it in this video. SnapVault's really useful, I suppose, if you want to retain snapshots in the Sydney cluster, for instance, for a much longer period of time. In Melbourne, we've said retain the last 2, but maybe in Sydney we want to retain we want to retain 60 snapshots, and we could do that and use that for recovery purposes. It could be still for disaster recovery, but mainly it's for recovery purposes. So if you want to restore a virtual machine or restore some files, that's another method that you could use for recovery. So SnapMirror in this case, there's nothing much to this. I'm not going to select this box just now. We're going to select that in a moment in another backup run. All I want to do now is orchestrate the replication of a snapshot from the Melbourne cluster to the Sydney cluster using Veeam, which is what this is going to do with a SnapMirror. So it's going to still retain 2 snapshots, and then it's going to SnapMirror those snapshots across to our Sydney cluster. And that's it. I'm not going to do anything else. Everything else stays the same. I am going to run the backup job, click finish. And let's see what happens. So there's a first crucial point is to see this green tick, that it sees a relevant OnTap SnapMirror SnapVault relationship. If this fails and you don't have in the job to back up through traditional methods without the storage checked, then the whole job will fail. So this is a requirement for SnapMirror or SnapVaulting. So this means that my relationship has been configured in a manner that Veeam is happy with. Bit of screen tear. Not sure why I moved that. I think this is just this this particular version of VMware Workstation that does this. I don't think any other versions that I've been using does this sort of screen tear. But anyways, creating storage snapshots for backup. Beautiful. Let's have a look and see what's happening here. Oh, there we go. So we've got this auxiliary snapshot that it's created. So this is part of the backup job, so that we can back up the data to our Linux repository. And it's also gone ahead and created a new source snapshot. Technically, and hopefully this goes well, it will get rid of this older snapshot once the job is completed. If we have a look on the Sydney side, let's have a look if anything's happened just yet. So we should now see some snapshot copies over here. There's that original SnapMirror that the NetApp created, but we also now see a new snapshot that Veeam has orchestrated, which is good. That's exactly what we want to see. And the job is now, looks like it's pretty much complete, or it has completed. Beautiful. And if we have a look in the storage infrastructure, let's have a look and see what's actually happened. So we've got these two snapshots are still here, which is great. That's what we want to do. We want to retain two. And we've got the first snapshot replicated over here. So that's exactly what we want to see. So in the event that there's some sort of disaster issue, I can go straight to this latest snapshot and go, hey, let's bring this up in our ESXi servers in our Sydney cluster, even though I don't have them just yet, but I will do. And we could be up and running straight away. And as you can see here, so this Veeam source snapshot is an application consistent snapshot. So that's really good. If we've got SQL servers, domain controllers, and all the rest of those types of servers, they're all going to be application consistent. Anything that's VSS enabled. Now I want to just do one more thing. I want to come into here and alter the job and just select. Actually, let's just go back into this last job run and have a look at this particular server. If we just expand this option, this out here, using backup proxy mel proxy 1, sorry, excuse me, retrieving hard disk 1 from the snapshot on mel NetApp primary. That's telling us that for the main backup job for this particular server, which is going to our Linux hardened repository, it is used a snapshot created in mel NetApp primary cluster. Now you can, if you have a purpose for it, you can actually say, do the backup job from the secondary NetApp cluster. So our Sydney-based NetApp cluster, which might be useful depending on how you're configured and what your environment looks like. Now, I just worked with a customer who have two NetApp appliances in the one data center, and the secondary NetApp appliance is purely just as a failover option. So what they do is they replicate pretty much like what we've got here with Veeam. They replicate the snapshots to the secondary appliance, and then they also tell Veeam that to back up those virtual machines, use the secondary appliance, use the storage snapshots created there as the source for the backup job to the Linux hardened repository. That way we take away all the load off the primary cluster and let that just keep doing what it's doing, which is serving the workloads in their VMware environment. But the backups are all occurring on the secondary cluster. Now we can do that here. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense for us to actually choose that option because our Linux hardened repository is in Melbourne, our proxy server is in Melbourne, and therefore, why would we want to, grab all that data from the Sydney appliance and then pull it back over some sort of WAN link and store that data in our Melbourne repository? But just for fun, we're going to do it anyways. But this would be more useful if I had like a Sydney-based repository as well. Then and a Sydney-based proxy, then it will all work really well. That would be a best sort of a best practice configuration. But anyways, let's tick that box in the OnTap mirror to say use as data source and click finish. Let's run the job. And what we should see now, if I hit the back button to the previous job, so again, just to reiterate, we see here the Melbourne NetApp primary has been used as the source for this backup job. What we should see now is SID NetApp secondary here when this job runs. So let's watch what's happening. Getting storage snapshots for backups. Now, I think this is a new task. We are now waiting for the snapshots to transfer. And that way, this backup job can run. Actually, no, what's going to happen? No, this job is going to run first. Yeah. And then this task will complete. Waiting. I might just pause the video because this could take just a few minutes because we're doing it a little bit differently, and we'll come back once it's completed. Okay, so that just took a couple of minutes. And now if we just have a look down here, and let's just expand this. So when it performed the actual backup job to the Linux hardened repository, it actually used the source data from the Sydney cluster. And like I said, that could be quite useful if you have your repository and proxy servers, your appliance all in the one location, in a different location to your primary cluster. So this is what they call a backup from a secondary storage snapshot. There's a few articles. I'll drop a link in the description so that you can do a little bit of reading up about it from a Veeam perspective. But that's all perfectly done. So that's exactly how we expected it to be. The last thing I'll just double check is in here in the storage infrastructure. Now, what you'll notice here is that those NetApp created snapshots have actually disappeared. So I didn't actually delete them; they disappeared on their own, which is good. So Veeam must have orchestrated that process for us, and now we have got our two source snapshots on the Melbourne cluster, and then we've got our two destination snapshots on our destination cluster, our Sydney cluster. So that's exactly how I want it. That's what the SnapMirror is supposed to look like. So like I said, in the event that we need to do a recovery, we're going to implement Veeam Recovery Orchestrator in a future video, and we're going to be able to use these snapshots as a means to do a disaster recovery setup. So we'll do that in in a next video. But that's it for now. That's two videos for the Veeam and NetApp integration complete. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's a little bit of a whirlwind, but hopefully you got a little bit out of it. I certainly learned a fair bit in my own time building up to making these videos. So this was really beneficial for myself, but I really hope it's been beneficial for you guys out there. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll look forward to chatting soon.